of the reasons why I wanted to make a video about Beowulf is because I fear that many people watch modern movies and they fail to go to the source. Now, I've always been one to go to the source, and when I have watched movies in the past that portrayed historical happenings or stories that are based on novels or based on myths, I like to go and do some research and find out what really happened. And most often I find that the historical aspects of docudramas are so far off base as to be outright lies. In movies that are based on mythology, I'm trying to think of one that I have seen that actually portrayed the myth accurately, and I can't think of any. The original Clash of the Titans with Harry Hamlin was bad enough, but I refused to see the new one. As a matter of fact, I almost cried in class one day when a student told me about the remake of that movie. I've not seen Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and I don't plan to, but I did see the travesty that was Troy with Brad Pitt, and the travesty that was Beowulf that had Angelina Jolie as Grendel's mother. No basis in reality, as if Beowulf was grounded in reality, but it bore no resemblance to the myth. Now, my son says, "Mom, why don't you just relax and enjoy these movies for what they are, entertainment?" And my reply is, these myths and these stories have been around for hundreds of years, and in some cases, many cases, thousands of years. People have continued to read them and have an avid interest in them. So what is the point of changing them? Having said that, I did see the movie that told the Beowulf story from Grendel's side, and I had no problem with that because that's an alternative version. But to present the story of Beowulf and change basic aspects of it, I'm sorry, I just can't go from that. Okay, I'm getting down off my soapbox, not my soapbook, and I'm going to talk about Beowulf. Now, as I present in lessons, Beowulf, we're lucky to even have Beowulf. Anglo-Saxon is Old English, and the Anglo-Saxons were a Teutonic tribe who came down into England to actually help the Celts fight the Picts who were in Scotland. And when the Anglo-Saxons got there, they beat back the Picts, but then they also beat back the Celts and ran them down into Wales and Cornwall and established their own kingdom in England. And England, of course, comes from Angleland, land of the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes were in there too. As such, being a Teutonic tribe, the Anglo-Saxons were heavily influenced by Scandinavian mythology. And as a matter of fact, Anglo-Saxon is closer to Old Norse than it is to modern English or Middle English. And Anglo-Saxon really fell out of favor. It was a force falling out of favor in 1066 when William the Conqueror beat the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings and made French the official language of England. And it was actually against the law to speak Anglo-Saxon or to write Anglo-Saxon. The English later did the same to the Welsh. They made the writing and the speaking of the Welsh language illegal. And that is one way to strip a country, to strip a people, I should say, of their national identity. The English also made the playing of the bagpipes illegal because the bagpipes were used to call the Scots to war. That's just an aside, but somehow to me it's all interrelated, and I just like to present useless bits of trivia. So the Anglo-Saxons established their country in their kingdom in England and ruled there from the fall of the Roman Empire, which I think what happened about 300 AD CE, somewhere around in there, up until 1066, when William the Conqueror did conquer the land of the Angles. But during that time, to say that the Anglo-Saxons ruled was not so simplistic, because the Vikings, who were known as the Norse at that time, they wouldn't have recognized the word Viking, made many incursions into England, and there were Viking kings who ruled Anglo-Saxon England at different periods. Beowulf was perhaps written to commemorate the ruling of one of these Viking kings, and of course his name escapes me at the time. But what is interesting about Beowulf is that we did not even have knowledge of Beowulf for a very long time, and that is because when the Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, was outlawed, people basically forgot how to read Anglo-Saxon, and they weren't speaking it as well. And so many Anglo-Saxon manuscripts were either burned, not from the point of view of burning books, but were burned for other reasons, or they were written over. Now, they were written on vellum, which is lambskin, and it was at a premium, and so they would write over it, over the writing of the Anglo-Saxons, and I'm not quite sure how they did that, and I had a class in Anglo-Saxon, and the instructor told us about that, but unfortunately the technique escapes me now. But we lost manuscript after manuscript of Anglo-Saxon literature, which is a real pity, because the Anglo-Saxons were masters and or mistresses of the written language. They had a very rich vocabulary, and they would write metric poems in which if they didn't have a word to suit what it was that they wanted to express, they would combine words. For example, the ocean was called the whale road, the road that whales traversed. And so they had a very rich language, and most people are not even aware of that. But at any rate, Beowulf was one of these manuscripts that languished, unread, unknown, until I think it was the 18th century. It could have been the 17th century. Or excuse me, the 19th century or the 17th century. It's in the lessons on Blackboard, when it was rediscovered and people had actually been able to learn how to translate Anglo-Saxon. And behold, here was Beowulf. And so the fact that we have the story of Beowulf is a slight miracle in and of itself. One extant manuscript. All of the other manuscripts of Beowulf, who knows what happened to them? And how much more have we lost from not having these manuscripts written by the Anglo-Saxons? So that's a little bit of the history of Beowulf and how it came into our possession in modern times. Now, Beowulf means Beowulf, and a Beowulf was a bear, and that's the only thing they got right in that travesty of a movie with Angelina Jolie. Now, Beowulf was a Scandinavian, and he came to help Hrothgar rid his country of Grendel. Now, Grendel was a horrific creature and was considered a son of Cain, the offspring of the devil. And his mother was not a beautiful creature like Angelina Jolie. She was horrific. She was the wife of Satan. And she was even more lethal than was Grendel. But Beowulf, in the typical heroic mode, comes on a quest to rid Grendel and make the mead hall safe for Hrothgar and his people. And when Beowulf is already famous by the time this comes about, and he is well known for his exploits, which he is happy to share with others. I wouldn't say that he's a braggart, but he's quite willing to share his exploits and extol his own virtues. And so he comes to the mead hall with Hrothgar, and Grendel comes and attacks, and he is able to kill Grendel. And again, I'm not going to go through this poem point by point by point, because you can do that, but I want to talk about how it fits into the heroic quest. He goes on the quest, he kills Grendel, and then he has to fight Grendel's mother. Now, Grendel's mother is never given a name, but he fights her and he defeats her as well. Now, that could be the end of the story, but it isn't the end of the story. Beowulf goes back home, he becomes king, and rules for many years. What is Beowulf's tragic flaw? Well, it isn't his hubris, and he's not punished for his hubris. It is that he has no offspring. And to have no heir, he doesn't even have a female heir. To have no heir was really a negative thing, not only in Scandinavia, but in all of the ancient world. He had no one to take over his kingdom when he died. But in his latter years, a dragon comes to scourge the countryside. And Beowulf, in his old age, goes out to fight the dragon, and the dragon slays him. And this is the true tragedy, that once Beowulf dies, his country basically falls apart, is open to conquest by invaders, and is, again, basically just wiped off the face of the earth. And that is the true tragedy of Beowulf. Even though he did perform such heroic quest in his youth, including killing Grendel, there's nothing left of him. He has no one to keep singing his exploits and to keep his name alive, except, of course, for the anonymous poet who wrote this down. Now, Beowulf was no doubt handed down orally for a very long time before it was written. Whether there are manuscripts in Scandinavia, we really don't know. But it was most obviously passed down through oral tradition long before it was written down. Was there a man named Beowulf? We don't have enough information to know that. If Robert Graves is correct, then there probably was a man named Beowulf, because Graves says that all myths or legends of heroes are based on actual people. So perhaps there was a king named Beowulf, and perhaps he did die without an heir, and his kingdom become for naught. Beowulf is also interesting because it is a mixture of pagan and Christian ideology. Now, we see this in other myth when Christians came into Scandinavia and into England in particular, and melded the Christian myth with the pagan myth. We see this in Saint Bridget in Catholicism, who was originally a Celtic triple goddess. The missionaries often built churches over the sacred groves and temples of the Celts in England and in other places. And in Beowulf, the poet consistently refers to Jesus, but yet there are traditions left over from Scandinavia. For example, there is the Wyrd Guild, and the Wyrd Guild is a man price. If you killed somebody, you weren't necessarily put to death for that, but you had to pay the person's relatives the money that you remunerated them for killing their relative. So the higher up in status and the richer the person was, the more money you had to give the family. We also get from Scandinavian myth the wyrd, which is fate. W-Y-R-D. And when you see the Wyrd sisters in Macbeth, they're not called the Wyrd sisters because they're strange, but because they foretell what is going to happen to Macbeth. And so when Beowulf dies, that is his wyrd, his fate. And so you also have the concept of fate within Beowulf that we see in other tales of the hero. So that syncretic mix of Christianity and pagan myth was certainly evident in Beowulf. We see it in other Celtic myth. We see it in other Scandinavian myth. I want to go off in tangents here and start talking about other Scandinavian myths, including that of Wayland the smith. And you know something? I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to be quiet. You had in Scandinavia Wayland, and I can't remember if I talked about this earlier or not, but you had, you didn't have. There was the myth of Wayland the smith. And Wayland was lamed, intentionally lamed, so he could not leave Scandinavia and come to England. And Graves in the Greek myths talks about Hephaestus, who was also lame. Now, Hephaestus was supposed to have become lame when he was thrown off of Mount Olympus, some say by Zeus and some say by Hera because he was so ugly, and others say he was born lame. But Graves proposes that, considering that these myths are so similar, that ancient societies did lame their smiths because they were so important to those cultures. They didn't want them running off and going to other towns or other cities and becoming smithies there. Wayland, however, does escape Scandinavia and does make it to England, where he also becomes the smith god there as well, and is well known. So that's just another little aspect of Scandinavian and English myth. And I think I'm not going to go off any more tangents, and I think I'm going to be quiet. And that is the tale of Beowulf, who was so brave and went on a heroic quest, but his tragic flaw was he could not escape his wyrd, which was to die childless.